Citizens should be practitioners of civic virtue in their conduct towards government. They should be ever willing to fulfill the duties of citizenship. This includes compulsory duties like military service they must take if they are to preserve the principle of limited government through citizen self-reliance. End quote, Dallin H. Oaks. Good morning. I, Sadie Smith, and my partner, Bronson Gutierrez, stand firmly for the resolution. The United States should reinstitute the mandatory military draft. Before we dive into this heavy and tedious subject, let's define some terms we will be hearing used frequently throughout this debate. Observation 1, definitions. Reinstitute, to institute something again. Mandatory, required by law or rule. Draft, a system in which young people are required to join the armed forces of a country for a period of service. All these definitions are from Merriam-Webster.com. Observation 2, harms. Harm 1, without collective contributions, our nation is divided. Without collective contributions, our nation is divided. Quote, there is no advanced industrial democracy in the world today more politically divided or politically dysfunctional than the United States. How did the world's most powerful country get to this point? To paraphrase a great American writer, slowly, then suddenly. The Capitol riot was not just years in the making, but decades. That's because of 3 distinct futures in American society that have been ignored by U.S. politicians for far too long. The enduring legacies of race, the changing nature of capitalism, and the fracturing of our collective media land. Source, Time.com, Ian Grimmer, January 16, 2021. Summary, America is in desperate need of collective contribution and unity among Americans. Every day our country is becoming more and more divided. Our own citizens are killing each other, stealing from each other, and it's not just the money. People are stealing their friends' jobs, their friends' spouses, and so much more. There has never been more of a need for unity than now. A military draft would unite all people, rich and poor, old and young, Republicans and Democrats, the depressed and the optimistic. Harm 2, not enough people signing up. Not enough people signing up. Quote, recruits tend to be drawn from a shrinking segment of the population, from a small number of mostly southern states and families of veterans, a group whose share of the population is lower than any time since World War II. The armed forces continue to enjoy public support, but this skewing of the recruiting pool risks widening the divide between service members and the citizens they're sworn to defend. End quote. Source, Bloomberg editorial, Clive Crook, July 12, 2021. Summary, less and less Americans are volunteering for the Army. Being based on volunteers only, you must have enough people that are actually volunteering in order for this system to work, and this is not the current case. Shifting into the mandatory military draft, the U.S. wouldn't need to worry about losing a battle or reaching the Pentagon's standards. It would also create a bridge between the division in America's people as stated previously. Harm 3, lack of security. Lack of security. Quote, an over-reliance on technology may become a critical vulnerability for the U.S. military, should its satellite or command and control networks be compromised. An addiction to technology by the United States has also led to a legacy of weapon acquisitions in the post-2000s that is frankly catastrophic. Funneling billions upon billions into moonshot after moonshot, the United States has failed to bring few of its new weapons in the last 20 years to full maturity. Source, The Infographic Show, 2021. Summary, while America spends more on its military than any other country on the planet, the U.S. is not addressing its critical lack of soldiers. Technology can get you only so far, and a single EMP would make much of the U.S.'s equipment useless. This is why the draft is necessary. Observation 3, plan. Mandate, to reinstitute the mandatory military draft. Agency, the executive branch. Enforcement, the independent agency inside the executive branch, the Selective Service. Funding, the Selective Service system would pay for our plan. There would be no extra cost as the Selective Service has already planned for this. Observation 4, advantages. Advantage 1, allows military to have sufficient number of soldiers. Allows the military to have sufficient number of soldiers. Quote, one important advantage of conscription is that it assures a sufficient number of people in the military. In case of emergency, a country needs enough people who are familiar with how to defend a country. Therefore, even though mandatory military service dates back many hundreds of years, it can still be important, especially with the increasing tensions between countries that might arise in the future. Source, Environmental Conscience, Stephen C. Markoff, August 5, 2021. Summary, this is very straightforward. Without enough soldiers, we will not be able to defend our country. If all of a sudden a World War III explodes and we have the meager amount of troops we have now, we will not be a feared army, we will be a fearful army. With enough soldiers, we won't worry about any wars breaking out because we will be prepared. Advantage 2, strengthen the bond with all classes. Strengthen the bond with all classes. Quote, Pew Research tracked an increase in partisan differences from 15 percentage points in 1994 to 36 points in 2017. Dan Glickman, JD, former U.S. representative, stated that mandatory service would be a solution to our current dysfunction because national service, be it in the military, Peace Corps, or other public and private sector opportunities, breaks down the barriers of race, class, income, geography, and even language. Young adults are granted the opportunity to see their peers and fellow Americans as a member of their team. Around 30 countries have compulsory military service. Switzerland, which has 4 official languages and 3 major ethnic groups, bridges its divide with a mandatory national service program. The European nation is identified as one of the happiest countries in the world by the United Nations. End quote. Source procon.org, July 8, 2021. Summary. If there is one thing America is struggling with right now, it's unity. As we have said time and time again, America is divided and not even trying to reconcile with the opposing side. There are wide gaps between all types of dilemmas, 2 of the biggest being political and racial. With the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the old, the young, the brave and the weak, we are becoming divided into 2 Americas. The military gives a bridge across the gap of poverty-stricken and the prosperously given. This gives them a chance to see the other side of life, learn about the other, and make a strong connection, which metaphorically helps start to build another bridge. Advantage 3, increased security. Increased security. Quote, without the draft, registration on its own has been likened to an insurance policy against any future threat. Any major conflict with a great power adversary, however unlikely, would require a much larger military than the country has at present. End quote. Source, The Conversation, Max McGiles, June 7, 2021. Summary, with the draft, our country would be much more strong, secure, and unified. Given the domestic and international challenges ahead, the American people will need to collaborate to build a safe, prosperous, and sustainable future. The current partisan divide threatens to make such collective action difficult. It's time for the United States to reinstitute the mandatory military draft to help Americans build the future they want together. Thank you for your time. I am now ready for cross-examination.
Cross-examination of 1AC by the 2N. Good morning.
Good morning.
Are the judges ready?
Yes.
On the timer?
Yes.
And the affirmative. May I please have a copy of your 1AC? In your mandate, you stated that your only mandate was to reinstitute the draft. Who would be drafted? Men and women?
Men of the correct age.
What's the correct age?
My partner will bring that up in his speech.
Lovely. How much will the selective service pay for this new plan?
My partner has 3 pages of evidence on that. He was going to bring that up anyway.
Looking forward to it. Can you explain the credentials of Bloomberg?
Yes. Just give me 1 second. Many companies search for a purpose. Bloomberg was born with one to change the world for the better. It's there in their products, which started a revolution in financial markets that changes lives to this day.
Do you know if it leans toward one party, one political party?
It is completely non-biased.
I'd like to hear some evidence for that. I'm not so sure I trust that. If you are going to exclude women, how do you plan to combat the inevitable uproar that will result from doing that?
They can still volunteer, they just don't have to be drafted.
But there will be pushback from men and women because women will not be required and men will. Only men will be required. How are you going to combat that?
That's not part of my resolution, it's only to reinstate the mandatory military draft.
Can you repeat your second advantage?
Yes. Strengthens the bond with all classes. Do you want me to read the quote?
Yes.
Quote, Pew Research tracked an increase in partisan differences from 15 percentage points in 1994 to 36 points in 2017. Dan Glickman, JD, former U.S. representative, stated that mandatory service would be a solution to our current dysfunction because national service, be it in the military, Peace Corps, or other private, public, or private sector opportunities, breaks down the barriers of race, class, income, geography, and even language. Young adults are granted the opportunity to see their peers and fellow Americans.
Thank you. That's plenty. Last question, can you explain how time is a credible resource?
Time.com.
Yes. Sadie.
Time.
Oh man.
Thank you for your time. We have 2 minutes of prep time.
One minute. Time. Nancy.
You got it.
Are the judges ready?
Yes.
Is the timer ready?
Yes.
Affirmative.
Yes.
Good morning. Today my partner Sephora Turk and I stand against the resolution that the United States should reinstitute the military draft. We will start with observation 1, definitions. We accept all of Affirmative's definitions. Observation 2, harms. The affirmative team argued that for harm 1, the nation is divided by the current military state, but the negative team would like to argue that the military draft would just make division worse. Quote, while engagement by the public can be a good thing, a military draft for an international conflict can be unpopular with some people who would think they would be forced to fight for a cause they do not believe in, which can lead to civil unrest of a wide scale. As a result, the very foundation of democracy will be torn as presidents attempt to provide a picture of a strong home front. Taking, for example, the cases of the Civil War and World War I, protests had led to the suppression of free speech with the writ of habeas corpus and the Espionage Act suspended, which were used against those who interfered with the draft. During the Vietnam War, authorities used force against protesters, and advisors of President Richard Nixon eventually drew up a list of enemies of politicians and prominent anti-war activists who were then targeted for reprisal. Source: Brandon Miller, 2015, 12 foremost pros and cons of the military draft. So to sum that up, basically what the quote is saying is that the military draft will just cause disunity to continue to be a problem in the U.S. because not everyone is going to want to serve in the draft, and that will cause national unrest. Harm 2. The affirmative team argued that our current military does not provide enough people to be prepared for war, but the negative team would like to argue that the military draft violates American freedoms. So, quote, the U.S. experience since the end of the draft in 1973 is consistent with the above reasoning. Today's military personnel are the highest quality in the nation's history. Recruits are better educated and score higher on enlistment tests than their draft-era counterparts. In 2001, 94% of new recruits were high school graduates, compared with about 70% in the draft era. More than 99% scored average or above on the Armed Forces qualification test, compared with 80% during the draft era. Because of that, and because service members are all volunteers, the military has far fewer discipline problems, greater experience because of less turnover, and hence more capability. Since, for example, discipline rates, non-judicial punishment, and courts martial were down from 180 per 1,000 in 1972 to just 64 per 1,000 in 2002. And more than half of today's force are careerists, people with more than 5 years experience, as compared with only about 1/3 in the 1950s and 60s. Source: Christopher Jen. So what this quote is saying is that the military draft violates American freedoms, and the current draft is allowing more qualified soldiers to be a part of the draft instead of just recruiting a bunch of non-interested, non-qualified soldiers to make the numbers higher. Harm 3. The affirmative argued that the current military has a lack of security, but the negative team would like to argue that the U.S. is plenty prepared for war. Quote, the potentially devastating consequences of the next big war demands that the U.S. military and the nation as a whole prepare as much for this scenario as for the range of lesser challenges demanding attention today. Today's wars, likely contingencies, are simply running the Defense Department all require time, energy, and resources. Choices and trade-offs must be made. Nevertheless, the Pentagon must identify the gaps that would put the United States at biggest risk in a large, prolonged conflict against a highly capable adversary, and mitigate those risks to the greatest extent possible. Source: David Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel, WarOnTheRocks.com, 2016. So this quote is basically summarizing that the U.S. is plenty prepared for war because of its all-volunteer force. It allows the people to be more willing to do their best, and there are plenty of people in this country who would like to serve and do serve because it's what they want to do for their country. So, observation 3 is the plan. The affirmative team didn't exactly elaborate on their mandate. They just said to reinstitute the mandatory military draft. So we don't exactly know what the mandatory military draft would entail, whether that's women or men. They did, however, argue in cross-examination that women would not be a part of their plan. So, quote, like many laws that appear to benefit women, men-only registration actually impedes women's full participation in civic life. Limiting registration to men sends a message that women are unqualified to serve in the military. Source: Ria Tobacco, requiring men but not women to register for the draft is sex discrimination, January 8th, 2020. So the affirmative team is arguing that women are not going to be part of the mandatory military draft. So therefore they're violating true women's rights to serve our country. Okay, observation 4, advantages. Okay, here we go. The affirmative team said that an advantage of reinstituting the military draft would be to allow the military to have sufficient numbers of soldiers. But like I said before, the military is plenty prepared, especially with the all-volunteer force, because people are more willing to be more diligent, I guess. We don't have to deal with runaway soldiers or soldiers. Advantage 2, it would strengthen the bond of all classes. I'm going to, actually that's really a quote, I'm not. But just back to what we argued earlier, the military draft would only make disunity worse because of the controversial arguing that would probably occur if two sides had different opinions on the draft. And lastly, I'm going to wrap it up with advantage 3, increased security. As I read earlier, the country is plenty prepared because of the all-volunteer force. There are actually studies that prove that the all-volunteer force is much more secure than a military draft, using, I guess, examples from several countries around the world. So yeah, thank you for the time. I'm ready to be cross-examined. Cross-examined.
Cross-examined.
Yeah. Whatever.
Are the judges ready? Is the timer ready? Affirmative.
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you just restate real quick the tagline of Harm 2 and 3?
Sure.
Just the tag.
Just that. Just let me find it. Harm 2. Okay, Harm 2 is your tagline or ours? Yours. Okay. The military draft violates American freedom. That was Harm 2. And Harm 3, the U.S. is plenty prepared with the all-volunteer force.
Thank you. Sorry. Can you state your funding? Wait, can you state your plan again?
Our plan, the only plan I addressed was the mandate, which was not clearly stated in the NSC, so we just kind of brought that up.
You kind of skipped over a little bit. Okay. Can you tell me the credentials of Christopher Jen?
Sorry, I didn't know if I had that on papers for a second. Yes, I can. Christopher Jen, an American economist, was a recipient Benjamin Hook's Distinguished Service Award. That's really
Okay,
weird
that's
word.
enough.
Okay.
Can you restate the date of Harm 1?
Harm 1. Uh, 2015.
Thank you. You said when are trying for the mandatory military draft, we're recruiting people, right?
Mhm.
So and you said we would be getting unqualified people who aren't trained in your Harm, correct? Or
Mhm.
advantage, whatever it was. There is training for the military, right?
That was not stated in your plan.
There's, in the general sense, there is like a boot camp before you go and kill people.
Okay.
No, like we're on the same page.
Yes.
So if they're unqualified at the beginning, they will be trained, right?
Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean
That's-
that
thank
they'll
you,
want
thank you.
to do it.
My just last couple of questions. Women birth children, right?
Yes.
And if women were in the mandatory military draft and there's the same general age as their husband, if they are both recruited, who's gonna take care of their kids?
They probably wouldn't have kids yet because recruiting typically starts at 18, although you did clarify that.
Okay, but we didn't clarify that, but you can still have a baby at 18.
Could, but if you knew you were going to be drafted, you wouldn't.
But if drafting came as a thing when you had a 2-week-old, what would you do? What is y'all's plan for that?
We're not the one coming up with a plan. We're just arguing against yours.
Interesting. Can you talk about advantage? Can you please bring up the study that you were talking about for advantage 3? You said there were many studies. Can we hear about them?
Sure, although I don't have it up here because it's in the other negative evidence and I don't have that.
No, can you bring it up in the next one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Franz, how many times?
18.
Mhm.
Mandatory military service has been debated for centuries. 2 millennia ago, the famous Plutarch captured an argument favoring a form of conscription nearly identical to the modern-day U.S. draft. He stated, when rich as well as poor, plebeians and patricians should mingle again in the same army, the same camp, and engage in one common service for the public, they would be mutually disposed towards reconciliation and friendship, end quote. Forms like the draft have been instated again and again since the time of Plutarch for its immense benefits and the necessity of security. For these reasons, my partner Sadie Smith and I, Bronson Gutierrez, are for the resolution. The definitions are definitions. They accepted all of our definitions. However, they disagreed that the draft is a violation of human rights and American freedom. However, our definitions for the draft clearly states the enforcement by the government of its constitutional right to require all citizens of sufficient age and capacity to enter the military service of the country. It is a procedure by which individuals are chosen for conscription. So that says it's a constitutional right, meaning that it is not a violation of human rights. Moving on to, they said that the draft divides. We could not have won World War I or World War II if we did not have the draft. Vietnam is a terrible example of the draft. Quote, more than 3/4 of the men who fought in Vietnam volunteered to join the military. Of the roughly 8.7 million troops who served in the military between 1965 and 1973, only 1.8 million were drafted. 2.7 million of those in the military fought in Vietnam at this time. Only 25% of that 2.7 million were drafted, and only 30% of the combat deaths in the war were draftees. Source 17 Wild Facts About the Vietnam War. We Are the Mighty 2021, Blake Stillwell. So that says is that 3/4 of those in Vietnam were volunteers, which completely contradicts what they said about Vietnam. And again, we could not have won World War I or World War II without the draft. And actually, during the Great Depression, we were all divided, and World War II united us because we were all fighting for the war effort. Harm 2, not enough people volunteering. Not enough people volunteering. They said that we have enough soldiers at it as it is. Actually, this is not true. Quote, Defense Department data shows that the military fell short of its recruitment goals for nearly all of the services in 2021. The Army and Navy failed to reach their goals in recruiting for active duty, reserve, and Army National Guard. Source KYMA.com, 2022, April Hettinger. Summary, the negative is attempted to show that the draft is unnecessary and that we are hitting our recruitment goals. However, this is a lot of troops that we are missing. My partner can bring out more evidence. We have like 3 pages on how we're not hitting our numbers. They said that we are completely secure with our volunteers. However, if we are not hitting our recruitment numbers that the Department of Defense requires, then we are insecure. They know the exact number that we need. And if we are not hitting those numbers, then we are inherently insecure. Quote, the U.S. today has 1.2 million active personnel compared to China's 2.3. Source, this disparity gets even worse when you take a look at the reserve personnel. Source, American versus Chinese soldiers, 2020 infographics show. Summary, since we're not hitting the Department of Defense's quota numbers, we have an inherent lack of security in our current system. Moving on to our plan, mandate to reinstitute the mandatory military draft. This is for men ages 18 to 25. The agency is the executive branch. The enforcement is the selective service system. The form of the draft is what the selective service currently imposes. And it imposed, there are slight variations from Vietnam, which again, is not how Vietnam was. It has become modernized. Funding, the selective service system would pay for our plan. There would be no extra cost as the selective service system has already paid for this. In the 1960s, whenever we had the draft, our budget was nearly half. In the 1960s, quote, in the 1960s, our budget was $50 billion. Calculate that into the inflation calculator, and that's about half of our current military budget. During the draft, our inflationary budget was about $400 billion. Now it's $800 billion. In the wars in the Middle East, it was calculated that the average soldiers cost $1 million per year. This is largely due to there being a volunteer force. So the volunteer force is inefficient in how they spend money, and the draft would cut spending. And I suppose we could add a mandate where we could remove all the ridiculous spending that we put in our technology, because the US spends so much on our technology. We spend so much, and yet China is still catching up to us, and yet we're spending 3 times as much. And they have conscription, and we have the volunteer force. So what that means is the volunteer force is so much more expensive than the military draft. To the advantages, Advantage 1 allows the military to have sufficient numbers of soldiers. Allows the military to have sufficient numbers of soldiers. Quote, due to attrition and retirement, the military needs to find more than 150,000 new recruits every year to meet its overall end strength goal. Last year's target of 61,200 new Army enlistees was 20% lower than in 2018, when the Army failed to meet its goal. Source Bloomberg, Clive Crook, 2021. Summary, the draft would allow us to actually hit our numbers, and this brings me to my second advantage, ensures national security. Quote, concern over the threat of war had spurred President Roosevelt and Congress to approve the nation's first peacetime draft in September 1940. By December of 1941, America's military had grown to nearly 2.2 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. America's armed forces consisted largely of citizen soldiers, men and women drawn from civilian life. Source, take a closer look. America goes to war at the National World War II Museum. The woman volunteered. That is the flaw with our thinking. They think that just because we're not drafting the woman, that it's somehow unequal. If the women really want to join the military, they can volunteer. Summary, one of the best examples of proactive security is World War II. Roosevelt instated the peacetime draft, and because we had that whenever, on December 7th, 1941, whenever the Japanese invaded, we were quickly able to rise up and fight back. Without the draft, it would take us nearly 196 days to come back from a major invasion like that. We had a larger military, 2.2 million at that time, than we currently have now, which is ridiculous because our population has grown so much. Advantage 3, with collective contributions, we are unified. Quote, as countries like America continue to debate issues regarding healthcare, immigration, education, and a variety of other topics, there is a resounding feeling of division, both politically and economically. However, such a reality is mended with the implementation of a mandatory conscription program. Such a program will bridge such divides, encouraging solidarity in the process. This is specifically executed through military training, missions, and shared goals. Source, military conscription promotes national unity and pride, Carlia 2020. Summary, with the draft, we'd be pulling recruits from everywhere, which would diversify our military and make us stronger. Presley, or suppose the negative, just threw out a blanket statement to somehow argue against Sadie's advantage. And a blanket statement had no evidence backing up for the advantage, and I would like to see some evidence backing that up. Advantage 4, that is not Vietnam, because Vietnam, as I've said, is not a good example of the draft. Advantage 4, strengthen the military through unity and diversification. Strengthen our military through unity and diversification. Quote, that distinction has created glaring disparities across the country. In 2019, Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is home to Fort Bragg, provided more than twice as many military enlistment contracts as Manhattan, even though Manhattan has 8 times as many more people. Many of the new contracts in Fayetteville were soldiers signing up for second and third enlistments. This was not always the case. Military service was once spread fairly evenly throughout the nation because of the draft. But after the draft ended in 1973, enlistments shifted steadily south to the Mason-Dixon line. Source, New York Times, 2020, who signs up to fight? Dave Phillips. Summary, our current military draft is very unbalanced in the disparities of who signs up to fight. With the draft, we would be unified and we would be diversified, which would strengthen our military. In conclusion, thank you for your time. I'm now ready for cross-examination.
Are the judges ready? Is the panel ready? Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes. Okay. Good morning. Can you give me credentials for Blake Stillwell?
Blake Stillwell is a traveler and writer with degrees in design, television, and film, journalism, public relations, international relations, and business administration.
Okay, thank you. How is that an authority in the military draft?
He has degrees in public relations, international relations, and business administration. He's like 7 degrees. And I could continue. He has more.
No, thank you. How would you plan to cut draft spending in comparison to the current military?
Because we spend so much on paying for benefits and basically the paying for commercialization to get recruits to sign up. We're spending so much on that, and with the draft, we wouldn't have to spend money on commercialization, and we wouldn't have to spend so much money on technology and putting commercials on TV.
Okay. How would you plan on paying for all of the housing and feeding of your sudden increase in soldiers without exceeding the current costs that we're using now?
The U.S. has a lot of different bases, and it's actually estimated that if we did have the draft, we would be able to house all the soldiers and feed all the soldiers and all that. The Selective Service System has planned for this. That's why we men from 18 to 25 actually register. We are prepared to have the draft.
Okay. You argued that the current system is causing disunity, but how would excluding women from the draft make disunity any better?
We're not excluding women from the military, they can still sign up.
I know, but I said excluding those women from the draft.
But excluding women from the draft, we need people actually at home. If we take everyone home, we are significantly weakening our country. The women can still sign up. We're not counting them out of the military. They do a lot of things in our military.
How does that cause unity?
Cause unity? Because we're taking men from all over the country. And so we're diversifying the military, and they can see, they can relate to each other.
Okay. What evidence do you have on Advantage 2 with the whole 192 days to come back from the invasion or whatever?
That's somewhere over here. I would probably take it first, honestly.
While you're working on that, is quantity more relevant to the military than quality in terms of soldiers?
Soldiers. In a large-scale war, quantity matters a lot. In China, that's way more than the United States.
2 minutes, please.
2? Yes. Okay.
Judge ready? And the timer?
Yes.
And the affirmative team.
Yes.
Alright, so let's begin. Today's resolution is whether the United States should reinstitute a mandatory military draft. In my team, the negative is completely against that. To begin with, observation 1. The definitions have been accepted, but they said that in their definition for a draft, they were saying that the draft is constitutional. unconstitutional. However, quote, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Source, procon.org, 2021. This is not constitutional. Drafting people is, especially in times of peace, is not constitutional. This is forced servitude. Observation 2. Harm 1. They're saying that disunity is being caused because we are not drafting people. They're saying that the draft will unite people. However, this is not so because there is an inherent cost to the draft that people will see and people will be upset because of this. Quote, before the United States abolished the draft in 1973, some of its supporters argued that an all-volunteer force would be too expensive because the military would have to pay much higher wages to attract enlistees. But the draft does not really reduce the cost of national defense. It merely shifts part of the cost from the general public to junior military personnel. Career personnel are not typically drafted. This tax is especially regressive because it falls on low-paid junior personnel who are least able to pay. Moreover, not just draftees pay the tax, so do those who still volunteer despite the lower pay. In other words, the draft is a tax on military service, the very act of patriotism that a draft is said to encourage. The President's Commission on All Volunteer Force estimates that the draft tax during the Vietnam War was more than $8 billion per year in 2003 dollars. Source, Christopher Jen, conscription. This would not unify our nation. This would put a tax on those who are being drafted, and this would be detrimental to these people we are supposed to appreciate. Their second harm is saying that we have a weak military. However, despite a rough start, the AVF all-volunteer force has been a brilliant success. Quality is far better than under a draft. A volunteer military can be choosy and set higher standards. Even when the Army was reducing its requirements during the worst of the Iraq years, its quality standards remained well above those of conscript forces. Source, Doug Bandeau, 2012, Forbes.com. Meaning that we have a strong military. Drafting is not going to help us. Quote, the end of the draft has also dramatically improved commitment and morale in the armed forces. The difference is simple. Recruits who want to serve and succeed are likely to perform better than draftees who want out. So the sooner the better. Source, Doug Bandeau, 2012, Cato.org. How can we say that our military will be stronger when the people we are forcing to be there do not want to be there, but they want out immediately? Our professional military is stronger because the people want to be there. They are there for our country. They want to serve. They want to help. They're doing it. This is their life career. The third harm was that the United States is unprepared for war. But this goes back to the weak military. And it's lost. Once again, this goes back to the weak military. We have a stronger military under the all-volunteer force. We have enough people. We have people who want to be there. Our nation is secured because of this. Observation 3, the plan. They are saying they're drafting only men, but this sends a terrible message out because we're not including women. Like many laws that appear to benefit women, men-only registration actually impedes women's full participation in civic life. Limiting registration to men sends a message that women are unqualified to serve in the military, regardless of individual capabilities and preferences. It reflects an outmoded view that, in the event of a draft, women's primary duty would be to the home front, and on the flip side, that men are unqualified to be caregivers. The Military Selective Service Act not only perpetuates these stereotypes, it enshrines them in federal law. Source, Rio Tobacco, ACL, American Civil Liberties Union, requiring men but not women to register for the draft is sex discrimination, January 8, 2021. What's more, including women would promote equality. Quote, national experts agree. A congressional commission formed to study the selective service system recommended that Congress update the Military Selective Service Act to allow women to be registered too. And the Department of Defense has advised Congress that doing so would promote military preparedness as well as fairness. Source, Rio Tobacco, American Civil Liberties Union. Requiring men but not women to register for the draft is sex discrimination. January 8th, 2021. Adding women to our they want to strengthen our military with a draft. They want to add more people. They think it would increase our numbers. But by not recruiting women, registering them, mandatory, requiring them as they would men, it would not reach the standard that they want to promote. Observation 4, advantages. They said that through the military, they would promote equality, that they would unify our country, and that they would secure our nation. However, with the harms, they just link together. We don't need to bring up evidence against these disadvantages because we already disproved all of this in talking about the harms. However, there are several disadvantages that we need to bring up. To start with, quote, since people are now free to live and work where they want, one presumes participation in the National Service Program would be mandatory under the threat of a prison sentence. A National Service Program that takes 2 years out of the lives of young people or others contravenes the most important part of America, what has drawn people to its shores for centuries, individual liberty. Individual liberty. Source procon.org 2021. This is a disadvantage because when you use the military draft, you are requiring people, you are forcing them into something they do not want to do. It weakens the military and it will disunify our country further because you're making them do something they don't want to do. There will always be pushback when you have to require someone to do something. And our last disadvantage is that it is costly. The draft is costly. Quote, the cost of training a single service member is pretty high already. Spending tons of money training people who don't want to be there, only to have most of them leave the service as soon as humanly possible, is just not worth it. We already have plenty of people who join the military voluntarily and in boot camp or somewhere else down the line decide they make a wrong choice. Suddenly the tons of money spent in training them goes down the drain. It's all the people who make it through training and complete their service honorably that justify these losses. Source David Grove, 5 Reasons the Draft is a Terrible Idea, militarylife.com. In conclusion, my partner, Presley Adam, and I are against the resolution the United States should reinstitute a mandatory military draft. Thank you for your time. I'm not ready for cross-examination.
Morning. Could we have one world? Sorry, no, the judge's right. This time right. Okay. Could we have one World War I or World War II without the military draft?
Likely not, because the people we had in the military then were less than we do now.
So the military draft was okay then.
Yes, it was necessary because it was in the instance of war. This is peacetime. We do not need a draft in
Okay,
peacetime.
my evidence for Pearl Harbor, we had a draft for an entire year, a peacetime draft, and because we had that, we were able to repulse the Japanese. Correct?
Not necessarily. Did we repulse the Japanese because we had so many people, or because we had a draft, or because they were good in quality?
Because we had the draft. Their quality. Okay, moving on. Did you bring up any evidence against Harm 3?
Your harms were generally. Yes.
No, really? I don't remember. Can you please restate?
We mentioned that we would have a stronger military with the draft. Without the draft, because the people want to be there, and this means that our security will be ensured.
If people aren't signing up, did you have any evidence against our not enough people signing up?
No.
No. Okay, so if not enough people are signing up in peacetime, are people going to be signing up whenever we're fighting the second largest country on the planet, second largest empire?
We're
military?
immediately fighting a large force We have the draft, that is in times of war, we do not need one in peacetime. Besides quality over quantity.
So if World War III erupted like today, you would be okay if we institute the draft?
Absolutely, that's what the selective system is there for.
Okay. Now, what if China was to invade us right now?
We would build a draft. We have selective service
How long would that take? Isn't a peacetime draft proactive? Isn't proactiveness a good thing? Isn't it make us more secure?
Proactiveness is the selective service. We have the system in place to have people registered so that in times of direct invasion, in times of immediate necessity, we can rally them up.
The Defense Department knows how many soldiers we need per year, correct?
It ought to.
Okay? And if we're not hitting that number, then we have an inherent lack of security, correct? Because they know how much we need, and if we're not hitting that number, then we are getting less than what we need. Just for security, just to protect our home country. Correct.
Yes.
So then, if you can't get any more volunteers, the only answer to that is to have the military draft, correct?
Or to have women register.
How would having women register make more women volunteer? Hit the numbers.
No. If we
wouldn't,
need
correct?
no, if we need to use a draft and we have women in the draft.
Thank you for your time.
It's gone somewhere.
Okay, this is our 3-minute break. For our rebuttals.
They came up with it.
So they did not bring up any evidence against our black soldiers. Basically attacked the weakest, we attacked our weakest links, right? So we attacked I know, so we should attack people around the top. Yeah, because I kind of know cross-examination.
So I have this, like
Wait, so what you say this is in your summary has all three. Make sure you specifically say black soldiers.
I might have to reuse it just
Make sure that one's the biggest one, because they dropped it, so we have to attack the whole company. We should have like an entire page on it. Oh, you're one AC. Where's your one AC? You're, no, mine. Updated, the updated.
Oh wait, I just put that here. So I'm using it for one. You don't
It's all the same.
don't read it.
It's all the same color.
My thoughts. Personal. You may say.
wait, what was this?
Just to bring up black soldiers.
Merged.
A lot of evidence from which one turns out. I need to talk to
Did you read this one? Yes, you did.
Your cross-examination, what?
Oh, I can.
Yeah, you're not the one right up there at Goldberg and Kentucky, or which campus do you
The only answer is yes.
No, please.
Field vibe.
No, where, Great Heart, where is your, is it northern?
I already have increased security, so right is that. Well, it's lack of security.
I wonder, is it near highway?
Here, do this.
What do you want me to talk about?
Okay, y'all are driving your car, right? You're just riding?
Yeah.
Okay, that is time.
So this is what we use. Didn't bring up anything in Vietnam.
Got it. Executive team, just so you know, you have 1 minute left in your prep time, you guys have 3.
Use this.
Yeah. Can I use that?
Wait,
I think I have. I need that.
I'll
I can't be like last time.
Do you need anything?
Sorry, you need coffee. Hey, I know.
you have chocolate too.
I don't need
actuals because there's no
Whatever you want. Okay, ARs are.
Cross out.
Okay, the judges did
What do you draft?
timer. Affirmative.
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning. For our first negative rebuttal, I would like to restate the resolution for today, that the military draft should be reinstituted in the U.S. military, and me and my partner, Sephora Turk, are arguing against that. So we'll start with observation 1, definitions. We accept all of the affirmative definitions again. And I would like to repeat this quote that my partner read earlier, if I can find it. Because they argued that the definition of mandate would not necessarily violate the Constitution, because we did bring that up in one of our harms. And so I'm going to repeat this quote. Quote, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Source procon.org, 2021. Observation 2, harms. 1. The military draft would make disunity worse than it already is. Quote. Okay. So I'll repeat. The military draft would make disunity worse than it already is. Quote, as stated before, our military is as good as it is because the people who serve chose to be there. They want to do a good job. Furthermore, it's a good feeling to know that you're doing the hard work that not everyone is cut out for. By enacting a draft, we lose everything that makes the military great. Pride. Source, David Grove, 5 Reasons the Draft is a Terrible Idea, militarylife.com. So essentially what this is saying is that the military draft would not only make disunity worse, but it is as strong as it is because our volunteers are willing and they want to be a part of our military and they want to serve our country to the best of their ability. Harm 2. Lack of arms is not an issue if it is viewed in light of the draft's violation of American freedom. Quote. In 1988, for example, the U.S. General Accounting Office studied the effects of reinstituting conscription and concluded that an equally effective force under a draft would be more closely, even in a narrow budget sense, than the existing force. With a draft, a larger total force would be needed because draftees serve a shorter initial enlistment period than today's volunteers. Source, Christopher Ginn. So what this is saying is that essentially more volunteers would be needed, or more draftees would be needed, because draftees are serving the minimum time they can unless they want to be there, which is essentially just the same military we have today. Harm 3. The U.S. is prepared for war in the sense of the quality of the all-volunteer force. Quote, more recent experience demonstrates that the draft is not necessary to sustain force levels over time. Oh, wrong quote, sorry. Is that what it's called? Yeah, wrong quote, sorry. Quote, before the United States was abolished in 1973, abolished the draft in 1973. Some of its supporters argued that an all-volunteer force would be too expensive because the military would have to pay much higher wages to attract enlistees. But the draft does not really reduce the cost of national defense. It merely shifts a part of the cost from the general public to junior military personnel. This tax is especially regressive because it falls on low-paid junior personnel who are at least able to pay. Source, Christopher Ginn, conscription. So that has to do with cost. So they argued that the cost is going to be lessened by the draft, but it will actually just be the same as it was. And so for harm 3, another quote would be, let me find them. two quotes I would like to read in relation of, okay, they're not here. So I'm just gonna move on. Okay, so disadvantages, number one is that the military draft is no longer relevant. So quote, many Americans are questioning whether the draft remains relevant in the 21st century. Today's U.S. military is widely considered the most advanced, the most powerful, the best led, and the most capable military in the world. Source David Barnum and Nora Bensaho, WarOnTheRocks.com, 2016. So the draft is no longer relevant to the U.S., and so that's where I like to conclude. Thank you for your time.
A minute.
No, it's not. It's not it. Preparedness goals are gone.
It disappeared from me up there too.
It was two. I wrote it down. We all know I'm already running all of it.
Responsibility for 6 and 7.
Don't say killing people.
Responsibility.
6 and 7. Now I can find it. Classy. I need the definition of classy.
Oh, do better.
Okay.
Do better.
I need an opening quote. Oh, that's so trash.
I'll say it.
Okay. Are the judges ready? Is the timer ready? Negative team? Alright.
No.
Okay. I was like, well, alright. Let's just start. Okay, for observation 1, we were talking about our definitions, and they were talking about how it is unconstitutional to to institute the mandatory military draft. The draft, we brought in another quote about the draft being constitutional, and I will just repeat it for y'all. Quote, the enforcement by the government of its constitutional right to require all citizens of sufficient age and capacity to enter the military service of the country. It is the procedure by which individuals are chosen for conscription from uslegal.com. They say in times of peace it's wrong to put the draft in because we don't need more people if we are fighting a war, but I would like to point out, I don't feel like this is a great time of peace right now, but even if it's in a time of peace, you need time to be able to recruit all of them and put them through training so they're actually ready for the war. You don't want to start the draft in the middle of the war, as my partner was saying in the cross-examination. If you start it in the middle of the war, it'll take too long, and then. All right, let's move on to harms. For harm 1, the negative team are. Excuse me. We said. Without collective contributions, our nation is divided. We kind of got off topic with the taglines, but without collective contributions, they say we will become, the negative team says we will become even more divided if we are instituting the draft, but we disagree. Here's a quote, defense of American its ideals must be made collective again, lest Americans become culturally over-reliant on a small professional soldiery that shares increasingly fewer social commonalities with the people it is charged with defending. A national service program should augment the current all-volunteer U.S. military. This will foster a culture of universal contributions among citizens and prevent the emergence of a society so internally fractured that it lacks the will and ability to assert itself against America's biggest threats. Source, the national interest. Harm 2, they never brought up anything about our harm is not enough people signing up. They did not bring up any evidence or argue that. Instead, they moved it on to inequality, but our harm is not enough people signing up. Quote, according to the U.S. Army and Recruiting Command official website, the U.S. did not hit the recruitment goals for our regular Army, which is at 91%, Army Reserve, which is at 72%. oh, that's not the quote, sorry, that's just what I said. Quote, this limited supply compromises national security. In recent years, the Army has only just barely met the Pentagon's minimum cognitive aptitude benchmark for new personnel. The U.S. needs lots more recruits. Fewer and fewer Americans are volunteering for the Army. Without a sufficient number of recruits, our country is unprepared for large emergencies. Shifting to the mandatory military draft, the U.S. would need to worry about losing a battle or reaching the Pentagon standards. Harm 3 is we have lack of security, and the mandatory military draft would increase security. They keep, the negative team has brought up how even if we were bringing in unexperienced people, and it would be better to have a smaller army of more experienced people. But those experienced people they signed up not knowing how to be a soldier. They didn't know all the codes, or just whatever they do. But there will be training, and the people that live for the military had to go through the training to become good soldiers. They didn't magically just become good soldiers. They really had to go through training. And we just need more security. And quote, when it comes to more manpower, no military in the world comes close to that of China, according to global firepower estimates. The People's Republic has around 2 million active military personnel. The U.S. in comparison has significantly less, 1.4 million. Source Statistica. While the U.S. spends more on the military than any other country on the planet, the U.S. is not addressing its critical lack of soldiers. The negative team has also brought up how it would be expensive, but with the draft in place, the military can pay lower wages than it would take to attract a force of willing volunteers. Basically, with the military draft, we wouldn't have to spend as much money as we do advertising for people to be able to convince people to register. Another advantage would be it would strengthen the bond with all classes, as made clear by Army veteran Tom Wolfe. Quote, there is nothing in the civilian workforce that can approximate the bonding that occurs in the wardroom, ready room, or foxhole. Military personnel in those environments put up with much hardship, long hours, stressful working conditions, danger to personal safety, separation from loved ones, and more. However, because they're all in it together, they get through it. Source, military conscription promotes national unity. Thank you for your time.
1 minute, please.
Like half of it.
Not evidence.
No, I see.
I'll have a lot of paper this week.
What?
Y'all all have a lot of paper this week.
Almost done.
It's a little messy. Here's your. I said they kept bringing it up. I didn't say.
Timely.
Seriously? Oh my goodness. That's just a minute.
Quick minute.
Second negative rebuttal. Second negative rebuttal. The judge ready? The timer. In the affirmative. Alright, good morning. My partner and I still stand against the resolution of the United States to reinstitute a mandatory military draft. They went back to the fact that they believe that instituting a mandatory military draft would still be constitutional. However, the draft in peacetime, forcing people to serve in the draft that is not being used in peacetime is not constitutional. This is a violation of American freedoms. And I still don't understand why they're saying that it would be. Second of all, they keep saying that we do not, it wouldn't have enough time if we were to draft people later in times of immediate necessity, that there would not be enough time to train and equip, to build them up. However, we don't need a draft at present. The selective service system is constructed so that in the event of a national emergency, we can call up the needed manpower swiftly and efficiently. The draft is for times of immediate necessity. To reinstitute the draft now would be an unnecessary expense to the United States. Degrees would be stalled, careers would be halted, newlyweds would be pulled apart, parents would have to bid farewell to the children they were deceived into thinking that they would be able to keep close. And for what gain? To bring an extra financial burden on our country? To force servitude on millions more Americans and call it patriotic? Is this freedom? Is this what our country is going to resort to? What kind of message does this send? I personally know of someone who completely left his country because of a military draft. This country was communist at the time, and now it is no longer, and it has a free, of all volunteer military. A mark of a free country is in its free military. Our military is stronger when we have people who want to be there. The draft is not going to help unite our country. People will be against it. They will leave, they will fight, all these things. And what's more, not requiring women to register for to be drafted, that promotes inequality. That does. If we want to promote equality, our volunteer service is what is needed, because the people who want to be there will be there. It is not pushed, it is promoted, it is not pushed. A professional military is strongest because quality over quantity. The draftees, they will not be, there is a very limited amount of time that they are trained before they are pushed into battle. And that is good in times of immediate necessity. But for the volunteer military, we have selective service. We do not need to institute a draft in times of peace. Thank you for your time. That is all I have.
What's the rest of your prep time?
How much do we have left?
2 minutes.
Repeating, not constitutional, in my definition, this is constitutional. We don't need any peace, also in Ukraine. Ukraine had conscription before Russia invaded. Because they have conscription, they were able to repulse the Russians. It's an excellent example because it's like happening right now. And then,
Please yell at each other.
1 minute.
Actually, I would have been a 3 minute apple, but I could have used that. But then,
I tried telling you, but you wouldn't listen now.
Sounds like
Half of the class, right?
whoa, whoa, whoa. Hi, Simon.
I don't know what else there is to find for you.
Kind of.
You can get it. You don't have to.
No, I didn't.
You can say this if it's not.
Oh, what did I say?
Or not.
And the fog here, no, it's okay.
Fine.
Yeah, but then it's not like it's
I have to be persuasive. I was pretty convincing.
Yeah.
This is a formal
You said
debate.
it, John Kennedy.
We're not in-
Are the judges ready? Is time ready? Make it 10. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. John F. Kennedy. He said it with the military draft. And they argued that in times of peace, the draft is not needed. However, I brought it up with World War II. And because they seem to think I need to bring up another example, a good example right now is Ukraine. Ukraine had a conscription program before the Russians invaded. Because they had the conscription program, they have been able to repulse the Russians in several territories, and they have been able to win victories. If they did not have the conscription program, they would have lost lots of territory, and they'd probably already be conquered right now. So that's another example. They said that newlyweds would be torn apart, blah, 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 and, sorry, not blah, 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 but they said a bunch of other things, and yet they are arguing that women be in the draft. Without women, who would be at home? In World War II, women were able to work in the factories. They got all sorts of new opportunities, okay? And with the modern day draft, they would still be able to volunteer. That's another flaw with their thinking. They think that just because they're not concluded in the draft, they can't be in the military, and that somehow produces inequality. That is not true. Quote, the result is continuing support for reinstating conscription. For instance, the All-Volunteer Force Forum has taken the lead in pushing the draft. Okay, I would like to stop right there. The All-Volunteer Force Forum. Okay, continue. The Military Times reported on a panel discussion held in November 2019, during which life and retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson spoke. According to them, reported Todd South, conscription was inevitable because a combination of ever-growing missions for the military and outside pressures on the dollars being spent there will force it. Source, in the world's most militarized power, conscription is a tool of war. 2021, Cato Institute, Doug Vando. What that's saying is that conscription is inevitable. We should do it now while we have peace and while we're not in war. If we were to institute the draft whenever, say, China invades or even Russia, they have so many soldiers that it would take us forever to come back. Again, this is relating back to my Ukraine example and World War II example. And they have not brought up a single piece of evidence contradicting what my partner said. And I have brought up saying that the amount of recruits that we're drawing from people is not enough to fulfill the Department of Defense's quota. Quote, in fiscal year 2018, the Army sought an ambitious 80,000 new recruits. They dropped that goal to 76,500, but still only came in at 70,000 by the end of the year. And to meet that, like I said, the service spent $429 million in enlistment bonuses. In fiscal year 2019, the nearly 11,000 soldiers in the Army's recruiting command brought in slightly more than 68,000 new recruits on the active side, spending $329 million and another $90 million to add 15,000 soldiers to the reserves. Source, rising costs, dwindling recruits, increasing demands may bring back the military draft. 2019 Todd South. I can tell you from other sources, it is only getting worse. Every year, we are getting fewer and fewer soldiers, and the Department of Defense is having to lower their quoted numbers, and yet we're still not hitting those numbers. Because of this, the draft should be reinstituted to hit those numbers. Again, they know how many soldiers we need, and they know how many soldiers we need to repulse China or Russia or whoever was to invade us. And because we're not hitting those numbers, we have an inherent lack of security without the draft. Quote, during World War I, according to the National Archives Prologue magazine, the draft added nearly 2.7 million to the U.S. military, while voluntary enlistments accounted for only about 300,000. Source, what are pros and cons of the military draft class from 2017? Nancy Cross. Okay, so 2.7 million with the draft, and only 500,000 without the draft. Only volunteers. And in times of wars, it's been proven that volunteers drastically slow down, because who wants to volunteer to go fight in a war? Not many people. That is why the draft is necessary. If in times of peace we are not hitting our volunteering numbers, then in times of war it will be even harder to hit those numbers. And we need that many more soldiers, which is why the draft is necessary. Quote, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people and their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Roosevelt could not have said this if he did not have the mandatory military draft at the time. To review our military's problems, We are unprepared, we aren't getting enough soldiers, our nation is divided. The draft would fix all these problems. Never have we been invaded without the draft, and I, for one, do not want to be here when we are. Thank you for your time.
Good job, guys.
Good job, everyone.